She was 23 years old when she vanished behind enemy lines, a mother, a widow, and one of Britain's most dangerous spies. Her name was Violette Szabo. But before history called her a hero, she was just a young woman who loved too deeply and refused to surrender to the darkness consuming Europe. Summer 1944. France lay in chains, the swastika hung from every town hall, its shadow stretching across cobblestone streets where whispers could kill. Every sound, the clink of a boot, the creak of a door, could be the last thing you ever heard. Yet, in that suffocating silence, there were those who fought back. Men and women who carried pistols in handbags, messages in the hems of their skirts, and courage stitched into every breath. And among them was Violette. She wasn't a soldier by birth. She wasn't raised for war. She was born in Paris, raised in London, fluent in both languages, and full of life. When the war began, she sold perfume in a London shop. But war has a way of finding those who least expect it. In 1940, during an air raid, she met a man, Etienne Szabo, a handsome French Foreign Legionnaire. He was charming, fearless, and already on his way back to the front. They married after just 5 weeks. It was a love born in chaos, too short, too bright, like a candle flickering against a storm. Within 2 years, Etienne was dead, killed fighting Rommel's forces in North Africa. He never saw his daughter. Violette received the telegram on her 21st birthday, and something in her changed forever. That was the moment when love turned into purpose. She volunteered for the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Britain's secret army of saboteurs, spies, and couriers. Their mission: set Europe ablaze. They trained her to shoot, to parachute, to kill. She learned how to decode messages, how to disappear in plain sight, how to look a man in the eyes and make him believe she was harmless. Her instructors called her brilliant. The enemy would one day call her Phantom. In the spring of 1944, she was chosen for Operation Salesman, her second and most dangerous mission. Her task: return to France, rally the resistance cells in Rouen, and coordinate sabotage operations before D-Day. But this time, she wasn't just a spy. She was a woman with a broken heart, fighting in the land where her husband was buried. June 7, 1944, the night after D-Day, a black Lysander aircraft cut through the clouds over occupied France. On board, 3 agents, and among them, Violette Szabo. In her coat pocket, a Sten gun, forged papers, and a tiny silver locket with Etienne's photo inside. As the plane touched down in a field outside Limoges, she whispered to herself, "Pour toi, Etienne. For you." She stepped into the darkness, and the wind carried her into history. The war had many heroes: pilots, tank crews, generals. But Violette was something different. She was the face of ordinary courage, a young mother who traded the safety of her home for a world of shadows, betrayals, and coded whispers. She knew the odds. She knew what the Gestapo did to captured spies. Yet she went anyway, because love can die on a battlefield, but devotion never does. "If I don't come back, tell Tanya her mother loved her very much." Those words were found years later, written in Violette's hand. By the time they were read, she was gone. But her story, her fire, would survive. The story of a woman who walked straight into the lion's den, not for glory, not for revenge, but for love. And before the war was over, she would save hundreds of lives and lose her own. By 1943, Europe was a continent divided not only by borders, but by silence. France, once proud and luminous, had become a labyrinth of fear. The Gestapo's grip was absolute. Every street corner had eyes, every whisper had a price. And yet, somewhere beneath that iron shadow, the French resistance was breathing, weak, fractured, but alive. For the Allies, victory in Normandy would depend on these unseen hands. Bridges had to be destroyed, trains derailed, cables cut. But to coordinate that chaos, they needed someone who could walk through occupied territory as if born to it. Someone fluent, fearless, invisible. Her name surfaced again and again. Violette Sabo, young, bilingual, married to a fallen legionnaire, a woman with something to fight for and nothing left to lose. The Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was no ordinary branch of the British war machine. Created by Winston Churchill after the fall of France, it was born from desperation. While generals moved armies, the SOE moved ghosts. Their agents slipped behind enemy lines, armed with radio transmitters, cyanide pills, and a simple creed: learn to live on your nerves. They were the nameless army of Europe's underbelly: saboteurs, forgers, radio men, and couriers. But women played an even deadlier role. They could travel more easily, hide in plain sight, pass checkpoints that men could not, and when captured, their fate was unspeakable. Violette's training began in 1943. Scotland first. Cold mornings, endless marches, tests of endurance that broke even seasoned soldiers. Then the shooting range, where she learned to fire a Sten gun until her shoulder bruised black and blue. Next came sabotage, explosives, detonators, timing fuses, and finally, the art of deception: how to lie without blinking, how to kill without hesitation. Her instructors noted her precision, her speed, but most of all, her calm. "She's the kind who'll smile at you," one officer said, even as the noose tightens. Across the Channel, France was a different world. The occupation had settled like dust. The streets of Paris moved in careful rhythm. German officers strolling beside French policemen, black market traders whispering in alleys, women queuing for bread. The posters on the walls showed Marshal Pétain's face: work, family, fatherland. While hidden beneath them, someone had scrawled in chalk: Liberté. The Gestapo headquarters at Avenue Foch was the beating heart of fear. Interrogation rooms with soundproof walls, files stacked floor to ceiling. Every week someone disappeared: a neighbor, a friend, a name whispered once, then never again. In Rouen, a city still licking its wounds from the bombings, the resistance was in ruins. Leaders arrested, radio operators dead, all communication with London severed. If D-Day was to succeed, the network had to be rebuilt. That was Violette's assignment: to cross that invisible line between life and death and light the fuse again. She was briefed by Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, head of the French section. He looked at her file for a long time before speaking. "You understand the risk?" he asked. Violette smiled. "I do." He studied her face, the same face that could charm a checkpoint guard or a German officer. "Then God help you, Mrs. Sabo," he said quietly. "You'll need it." Before leaving, Violette visited her daughter one last time. Little Tanya was barely 2 years old. She kissed her forehead, whispered something no one heard, and walked out into the night. No grand farewell. No witnesses. Just a woman and her decision. Later, her neighbors would remember how calm she seemed that evening, like someone who had already said goodbye. June 1944. The war was reaching its breaking point. The Allies were preparing to storm Normandy, while the Germans braced for an invasion they could not see but knew was coming. In that moment, every railway sabotaged, every bridge blown, every coded message mattered. Britain was not fighting from the sky or the sea alone. It was fighting through the courage of people like Violette, ordinary souls who stepped into the darkness so that others might see the dawn. They called it espionage. But for Violette, it was something else. A promise kept, to her husband, to her daughter, to a France that refused to die. Behind her training and her weapons, there was still a human being, a woman who still carried the memory of a smile, a wedding ring, a life that might have been. And as she prepared for her second mission into France, the shadows were already moving. Someone was watching, someone waiting. Because in war, every courage has a cost, and every mission begins with silence, the kind that comes before the storm. June 7th, 1944. The night sky over occupied France was heavy with clouds and tension. Below, a sea of darkness stretched. fields, forests, and the faint glimmer of roads patrolled by German trucks. Somewhere above that darkness, a black-painted Lysander aircraft cut through the wind. Inside, 3 agents sat in silence. One of them, small frame, brown hair tucked beneath a wool cap, checked her Sten gun one last time. 23 years old, code name, Louise. She pressed her hand to the locket hidden beneath her collar. Inside, the face of Etienne Sabo stared back. At precisely 01:20 hours, the plane touched down on a makeshift strip outside Limoges. The pilot signaled. The team leapt into the tall grass. The wind smelled of rain and wet soil. The aircraft lifted again, swallowed by the dark. They were alone. Her contact was Philippe Lewer, a calm, calculating resistance leader operating under the alias Major Staunton. A man of discipline, trusted by London, and one of the few survivors of the Gestapo's recent sweep in Normandy. He greeted her with the reserved courtesy of a man who'd seen too many friends disappear. "You've chosen a dangerous time to visit us," he said quietly. Violette smiled. "Danger seems to be following me anyway." Lewer briefed her on the situation. The German counterintelligence network was tightening. Resistance groups were scattered, their leaders executed. The Gestapo had infiltrated several cells. Even trusted couriers could no longer be sure of one another. Violette's task was clear. Rebuild the communications between the Maquis fighters in Rouen and London. Organize supply drops. Restore the chain of command. Simple on paper. Suicidal in reality. Rouen was crawling with German troops, and the SD, the Gestapo's intelligence branch, had grown hungry. To walk these streets was to walk through a minefield of suspicion. Every glance could betray you. Every accent, every misplaced word could be the end. Violette moved through the city like a shadow. Sometimes as a milkmaid, sometimes as a housekeeper. Each role rehearsed, each lie perfected. She delivered coded messages hidden inside lipstick tubes, met informants in bakeries and cafes, always choosing the seat nearest the exit. Her charm was her armor, her eyes, her weapon. There was a quiet elegance to her danger, like a dancer balancing above the abyss. One afternoon in a small village near Salon-la-Tour, Violette met Jean, a local resistance fighter. He was young, only a few years older than she was, with the weathered calm of someone who had seen too much. He helped smuggle Allied airmen through the countryside, hiding them in barns and convents. For weeks, their paths crossed, always by chance, always brief. But in war, time bends. Moments become lifetimes. There was something in the way he looked at her, a quiet understanding. They both knew that attachments were dangerous, but the heart rarely listens to reason. Late one night, while waiting for a supply drop, he asked softly, "Why do you fight, Madame Sabo?" She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because someone I loved died believing this land was worth it. I can't let him be wrong." He said nothing more. The silence between them said enough. She carried a small radio transmitter in a basket of vegetables. The Germans called them pianists. The resistance called them lifelines. Through that crackling signal, she kept London alive. Each night she sent coded messages, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in barns, as bombs rumbled in the distance. Each word transmitted was a defiance, a heartbeat against the machine of war. But every signal risked betrayal. The Germans had detection vans, rolling ghosts with antennas, hunting the invisible voices on the airwaves. Each broadcast made her a moving target. By early July, the Gestapo was closing in. Reports of a young woman, fluent, confident, seen near several resistance hideouts, had reached their ears. They gave her a name, the woman with the bicycle. Violette's network had begun to fray again. Too many faces, too many secrets. She was running out of time. Still, she refused to leave. London ordered her to return after completing her mission. She radioed back one word: no. War had taken her husband. It would not take her courage. In those final weeks before her capture, Violette moved like a ghost across central France, delivering messages, organizing ambushes, even sabotaging a German convoy near Salon-la-Tour, an act that saved dozens of local fighters from arrest. But the net was tightening, and somewhere beyond the trees, an enemy convoy was waiting. She could not have known that the next few days would decide her fate, that her story, woven from courage and love, was about to be torn apart by the one thing even spies cannot outrun: chance. The hunt had begun. June 10th, 1944. France was burning. The Allies had landed in Normandy 4 days earlier. The front was spreading like wildfire across the coast. But inland, far from the beaches and headlines, a smaller war was being fought. Invisible, ruthless, personal. The Germans were desperate to crush the resistance before it could ignite, and the resistance, armed with nothing but courage and sabotage, was striking harder than ever. It was in this fevered chaos that Violette Sabo found herself trapped between two converging storms: the Gestapo's tightening noose and her own unyielding mission. Violette sat hunched over her transmitter, tapping out a coded message to London. Train ambush successful, convoy destroyed, many enemy casualties. She paused, listening for the confirmation signal, a faint sequence of tones from England. Then, silence. The line had gone dead. The Germans were jamming the frequencies again. She turned off the radio, wrapped it in oilcloth, and hid it beneath the floorboards. Within minutes, the faint rumble of engines echoed down the valley. German troops were sweeping the area. Intelligence had reported Allied agents operating nearby. Violette fled on her bicycle, pedaling through the drizzle, the transmitter now hidden in her basket. Beside her rode Jacques Dufour, a young French resistance fighter who had joined her days earlier. They cycled fast, through meadows and back roads, trying to reach a safe house in Aix-sur-Vienne. But the countryside was alive with danger. Every roadblock was a question. Every face, a test. At one checkpoint, a German patrol waved them down. Violette smiled politely, her French flawless. She handed over forged papers, her hands steady, eyes calm. The officer glanced at her bicycle. "Where are you going?" "To visit my aunt," she said softly. "In Limoges." The man hesitated, then waved them through. They rode away without looking back. By midday, they reached the village of Salon-la-Tour, a quiet place of stone houses and muddy lanes. They stopped at a small cafe to rest. Inside, locals whispered nervously. German trucks had been seen nearby. Violette kept her voice low. "We'll wait until nightfall." But fate does not wait. Outside, engines roared. A convoy of German vehicles entered the village. Soldiers poured out, rifles raised. The resistance had been betrayed. Violette and Jacques bolted for the door. Bullets shattered glass. She darted into the street, sprinting toward the edge of town. Behind her, German voices shouted orders. They dove behind a stone wall, returning fire with their Sten guns. Violette fired in short bursts, controlled, precise. Her training surfaced in every movement. But they were outnumbered, 20-1. For nearly half an hour, the firefight raged through the village. Violette covered Jacques as he tried to flank their attackers. She shouted for him to run. He hesitated. Then, a burst of gunfire. He fell. She was alone. Violette reloaded her last magazine and crawled toward a hedge. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. When the Germans moved in, she rose from cover and fired until her weapon clicked empty. Witnesses later said she fought with a calm ferocity. A young woman standing in the middle of a road, firing at an entire platoon until her last bullet was spent. Then, silence. She was captured. The Gestapo dragged her through the mud, hands bound behind her back. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, but her eyes were steady. She was taken to Limoges, interrogated for hours by SS officers. They demanded names, locations, codes. She gave them nothing. They slapped her, kicked her, threatened her with execution. Still, nothing. One officer, frustrated, threw her file across the table. "You are finished," he spat. She smiled faintly. "So are you," she said. "You just don't know it yet." After Limoges, she was transferred to Paris, to the infamous Fran prison. There, the Gestapo continued their interrogations. Her cell was small, damp, windowless. She was tortured repeatedly, hung by her wrists, beaten, starved. But she never broke. Another prisoner, Denise Bloch, later testified. She always kept her head high. Even when they took her away, she walked as if she still commanded the room. To the guards, she was defiant. To the other prisoners, she was hope. Meanwhile, in London, her handlers waited for news that would never come. Her radio had fallen silent. The network she helped rebuild was collapsing again under Gestapo pressure. But her sacrifice was not in vain. Before her capture, she had successfully transmitted the locations of key German convoys and troop movements to London. Those messages, later confirmed by Allied intelligence, helped resistance forces coordinate attacks that disrupted German reinforcements heading toward Normandy. Because of her, dozens of Allied airmen and resistance members escaped capture. Hundreds of lives saved in the shadows. In July 1944, Violette Sabo was sent east, to Germany, her official destination, Ravensbrück concentration camp, a place from which few ever returned. As the train pulled away from Paris, she looked out the small barred window. The fields of France, the land she fought for, were slipping away behind her. Somewhere in those fields lay her husband's grave, and somewhere in London, a daughter she would never see again. Ravensbrück, Germany, autumn 1944. A concentration camp built for women, thousands of them, political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, Romani, even Catholic nuns who had spoken against the Reich. The air smelled of ash and sickness. Every dawn began with a whistle. Every day ended with screams. Violette Sabo, once the bright-eyed London girl who loved perfume, poetry, and laughter, was now prisoner number 39177. Her uniform was striped and thin. Her shoes didn't fit, but her eyes, even now, refused to bow. They called her Die Engländerin, the Englishwoman. She shared her barrack with women from across Europe, French, Polish, Dutch. In this place of cruelty, friendship was an act of rebellion. One of them, Denise Bloch, recognized her from Frayne prison. They embraced silently, two ghosts meeting in hell. Another, Liliane Rolf, a radio operator from the SOE, whispered at night about London, about missions gone wrong, about the people they'd lost. Sometimes they sang softly to remember who they were. Violette never complained. When others were beaten, she helped them up. When rations were stolen, she shared her bread. In a world that had turned to stone, she remained flesh and fire. At night, she would touch the small locket still hidden beneath her uniform, the one that carried Etienne's photograph. She would whisper to it, as though the metal could hear her. "They didn't break me, my love, and they never will." Sometimes she dreamt of her daughter, Tanya. She pictured her walking through a sunlit park in London, clutching her hand. The smell of spring flowers, the sound of laughter. For a few seconds each night, the walls of Ravensbrück would fade away. But dawn always came, and with it, the sound of the guards. In October, Violette and her friends were assigned to hard labor, carrying stones, digging trenches, building roads for the German army, hours in the cold rain, with no food and no rest. Many collapsed. Those who couldn't stand were beaten or shot. When Denise's legs gave out one day, a guard raised his rifle. Violette stepped between them, shouting in German, "She's sick, not lazy. You'll gain nothing by killing her." The guard hesitated, then struck Violette across the face with the butt of his gun. She fell, blood in her mouth, but she smiled. That smile became a legend in the camp. To the prisoners, it meant something profound, that even here, defiance could still exist. As weeks passed, the war outside began to turn. The Allies were advancing through France. Paris was liberated. Rumors trickled into the camp through new arrivals. Hitler's armies were retreating, but hope was dangerous here. The SS did not like hope. They increased the executions, burning the evidence of their crimes. The sound of gunfire from the far yard became a daily rhythm. Violette watched the smoke rise from the crematorium and whispered to Denise, "Even if they kill us, they can't erase what we've done. Not all the smoke in the world could hide it." By December, Violette was frail but unbroken. Her hair had thinned. Her skin was pale. But when she spoke, people listened. She had become a kind of leader in the barracks, a quiet center of strength. Even the Polish women, who spoke little French or English, called her sister. When food ran out, she found ways to barter scraps. When morale broke, she told stories about London, about a country where the lights would soon shine again. And when new prisoners arrived, terrified, hollow-eyed, she greeted them with a whisper, "Courage, chérie, we'll see the sunrise again." But by early 1945, time had run out. The Germans knew the Allies were closing in. Orders came down from Berlin. All high-value prisoners were to be executed. On a freezing morning in February, guards entered the women's barrack and called 3 names: Violette Sabo, Denise Bloch, Liliane Rolf. They were told they were being transferred, but the others knew what that meant. The women embraced them one by one. Violette smiled faintly. "Don't cry," she said. "It's only a short journey." They walked together, arm in arm, through the frost, past the watchtowers, past the smoke. Some witnesses said they heard Violette whisper a prayer in French. Others said she stood tall and silent. No one knows her final words, but one guard, long after the war, admitted this. She died like a soldier, not like a woman we were told to fear. Violette Sabo was executed by firing squad at Ravensbrück in February 1945. She was 23 years old. Her body was never found. But her name lived on, carried by those she had saved, those she had inspired, and the child who grew up knowing her mother had fought for something larger than life. After the war, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross, the Croix de Guerre, and the Medal of Freedom from the United States. Her daughter, Tanya, received the medals on her behalf. In her speech, she said simply, "My mother did not die for a flag or for glory. She died so that no one else would have to live in fear." History remembers spies by their code names, their missions, their success or failure. But behind every mission is a heartbeat, a hand that trembled when the gun fired, a letter that never reached home. Violette Sabo was more than an agent. She was proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. And somewhere, if you walk the quiet lanes of Limoges or the ruins of Salon-la-Tour, the wind still carries her name. The war ended in May 1945, but for many, peace came like a stranger. Europe was free and hollow. Cities stood in ruins. Railways led to silence. Millions wandered, searching for those who would never return. In the English countryside, the letters from the War Office came in stiff brown envelopes. Each began the same way. "We regret to inform you." One such letter arrived at a small house in Stockwell, South London, addressed to Mrs. Riley, Violette's mother. Inside were 2 sentences that ended a world. "Your daughter, Agent Violette Sabo, is presumed dead in enemy hands. Her service to the Crown was beyond measure." Her mother folded the letter and placed it beside a photograph. A young woman with kind eyes, laughing in her uniform. For a long time she said nothing. Then quietly, she kept her promise. In the months that followed, fragments of Violette's story began to surface. Survivors from Ravensbrück returned, hollowed, trembling, but alive. They carried her memory like a light in their hands. One of them, Denise Bloch, had survived long enough to testify before dying of her wounds after liberation. Through her, the story spread, of a young Englishwoman who refused to speak, refused to kneel, and faced her death with calm defiance. Word reached Churchill's office, then the SOE headquarters at Baker Street. Her file was reopened, her mission declassified. For the first time, her name was spoken aloud in Parliament. In December 1946, the King approved the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for bravery. The citation read, "For the most conspicuous courage in operations against the enemy, she displayed the greatest gallantry and a steadfast refusal to betray her comrades." Her daughter, Tanya, was just 4 years old when she received the medal on her mother's behalf. Newsreels captured the moment, a child, solemn in a white dress, holding a medal too large for her hands. The announcer's voice trembled slightly. "This is the price of freedom." In France, her name became legend. Villagers who had once hidden her spoke of the Englishwoman with the calm voice and fierce eyes. In Salon-la-Tour, where she had fought her last battle, locals built a small monument, a simple stone cross, marked with her name. Every year on June 10th, flowers appear at its base, wildflowers from the nearby fields. They call her La Jeune Anglaise, the young Englishwoman. In 1958, a film was made, Carve Her Name with Pride. It told her story in black and white, the young widow turned spy, her capture, her courage. The film was romantic, perhaps too gentle for the truth, but for millions, it was the first time they learned her name. Audiences wept. Veterans saluted, and little girls across Britain began to whisper her name as if it were a secret code. Today, Violette Szabo's name is carved on walls from London to Paris. A statue of her stands on the Albert Embankment near Lambeth Bridge, facing the Thames, the river she once crossed on her way to training. Her face is turned toward France. The sculptor said, "I wanted her to be watching the land she died for." In Warmelo, Herefordshire, the Violette Szabo Museum stands inside a small country cottage, once her aunt's home. It is filled with her letters, her Sten gun, her lipstick case, her photographs. Visitors still come, schoolchildren, soldiers, historians, to see how ordinary a hero can look. But her story is more than medals and memorials. It is about the cost of conviction. She was not a trained assassin or a hardened agent. She was a shopgirl from Brixton who fell in love, lost that love to war, and decided that grief could become a weapon. When she volunteered for the SOE, she wasn't thinking of history. She was thinking of vengeance. And then, redemption. In her final letter to her mother, she wrote, "Please don't be sad if anything should happen. I have had a wonderful life, and I have no regrets. We must all fight in our own way for a better world." That better world was not perfect, but it was built on the shoulders of people like her, people who understood that freedom was not won by armies alone, but by individuals who refused to surrender their humanity. Historians later argued that her mission had little strategic effect, that her transmissions were brief, her sabotage small. But those who stood beside her knew better. To them, she was the proof that resistance had a face. Young, beautiful, and unafraid. Each year, survivors and descendants gather here. They bring photos, flowers, letters. Some whisper her name in the silence. It is said that in the quiet of that place, if the wind shifts just right, you can almost hear a woman's voice, calm, confident, speaking in French. "Courage, chérie. Hold on a little longer." The story of Violette Szabo is not about death. It is about the choices that define us when death is certain. She could have stayed home, raised her child, waited for the world to change. But she didn't. She entered the darkness, and in doing so, she lit a path that others could follow. Her courage did not end the war, but it reminded the world what we were fighting for. In every act of quiet resistance, in every whispered truth spoken under tyranny, in every woman who stands unbowed before power, her story continues. She lived with love. She fought with honor. She died with grace. And history, if it has a heart, will never forget her. The war ended, but endings are never clean. The victors marched through shattered streets, flags waving, bands playing. Yet beneath the applause lay ghosts. The Gestapo files were burned. The camps were emptied, and from the ashes, names began to surface, hundreds of them, men and women who had vanished without a trace. Among them was a file marked V. Szabo, British agent, dangerous. Inside, only 3 pages remained. The last line read, "Transferred, February 5th, 1945. No mention of execution, no record of her grave, just a void where a life had been. After the liberation, investigators from the Allied War Crimes Commission arrived at the camp. What they found defied language. Rows of empty barracks, furnaces still warm, personal belongings piled in the corners, shoes, combs, letters, a child's toy rabbit. From the walls, they peeled lists written in pencil. Among them, a faint name scrawled by a survivor. Violette, Anglaise. It was enough. Enough to tell the world that she had been here. Enough to make sure she would never vanish again. In Britain, 1946 was a year of rebuilding. Streets glistened after the rain. Ration lines still stretched down every block. But there was hope. Fragile, exhausted, stubborn hope. The SOE, the secret army that had trained Violette and hundreds like her, was quietly dissolved. Its members were ordered to silence. Their missions sealed for 50 years. They had fought in the shadows, and now they were buried in them. Major Maurice Buckmaster, head of the SOE's French section, wrote in his report, "We lost brave men and women whose names the world will never know, but they gave France the spirit to rise again." He mentioned Violette by name, only once. But that single line was enough to carry her into history. Her daughter, Tanya, grew up under the shadow of a photograph, her mother in uniform, smiling. For years she thought her mother was still away, on a mission. It was easier that way. Only later did she learn the truth, through strangers, through whispers, through history books that called her mother the heroine of France. In interviews, she would say softly, "Everyone told me how brave she was, but I wish I'd just had her home." In Limoges, the resistance rebuilt their networks. Those who had survived her last mission continued the fight until the Germans surrendered. Her intelligence, though incomplete, had exposed Gestapo safehouses in central France. It saved hundreds from arrest. Many of the men she worked with, the French maquisards, never forgot her. They named their daughters Violette. A few of them still visited her memorial every summer, leaving small bouquets wrapped in resistance flags. To them, she was not a symbol. She was memory made flesh, a girl who had walked into fire and never looked back. But history moves quickly. The war gave way to peace, peace to politics, and politics to forgetfulness. The Cold War began. The world divided again, East and West, NATO and Warsaw. The courage of spies like Violette was buried beneath new fears, new enemies, new secrets. And yet, quietly, her story endured. In classrooms, teachers spoke her name to students who had never heard of Ravensbrück. In museums, her face stared out from black and white photos. Not glamorous, not tragic, just human. War stories often end with victory, but Violette's story ends with silence, the kind that lingers after the guns stop. It is a silence filled with the weight of everything unsaid, the letters that never reached home, the lives that ended without witnesses, the small kindnesses that no one recorded. And perhaps that is what makes her story endure. Because behind every monument, every medal, every name engraved in stone, there is a silence like hers, a silence that demands remembrance. If you stand today on the bridge at Rouen, where her final mission began, the river glitters beneath you, calm, indifferent. Cars hum by, children laugh nearby. No one would know that 80 years ago, a young woman stood here, a pistol hidden beneath her coat, a message folded inside her glove, and a heart full of unfinished love. The war ended long ago, but her story, like the current of this river, never stops moving, because history does not remember the loudest voices. It remembers the ones who spoke softly and were never heard again. There are no gunshots here now, no footsteps of soldiers, no sirens, no whispered codes in the night, only grass, growing quietly where lives once ended. Time, it seems, has healed everything. But if you listen closely, beneath the wind, there are still echoes, a name, a voice, a heartbeat that refuses to fade. History books will tell you that victory came through generals, through tanks and treaties. But history is wrong, or at least incomplete, because victory is not just a matter of strategy. It is built from fragments, small human choices that history almost forgets. A woman who crossed enemy lines, a man who refused to betray his friend, a child who hit a stranger in a barn. These are the invisible foundations of freedom, the ones that do not make it into parades or speeches, but without which no flag would ever rise. Violette Szabo's story reminds us that war is not a contest of strength, but of endurance. The endurance to keep one's soul when everything else is stripped away, to still believe in love, in loyalty, in the idea of right, even when surrounded by darkness. She was 23 when she died. She had seen the world at its worst, and chose to be better. And perhaps that is why her name endures. Not because she won a war, but because she refused to lose herself within it. When she transmitted her final message, no one knew it would be her last. But in that brief burst of radio signal, the staccato rhythm of dots and dashes, there was something eternal. A human voice defying silence. A signal sent into the void, not to survive, but simply to say, I was here. We live now in a quieter world. Our wars are different, fought not always with guns, but with truth, with memory, with conscience. And yet the question remains the same. What would we risk for what we believe? Would we still cross the line when the price is everything we love? Violette's story does not ask us to admire her. It asks us to remember her, and through her, to remember ourselves. Because the same courage that lived in her still sleeps inside ordinary hearts, waiting for a moment to awaken. That is the hidden lesson of war, that even amidst ruin, humanity endures. Not in the roar of victory, but in the quiet acts of decency that history rarely records. Somewhere, beneath the soil of Ravensbrück, there lies no grave, no marker, no flag. Only the earth, holding what remains of her. But perhaps that is how she would have wanted it. To belong not to a monument, but to the living memory of those who still believe in courage. So when you next stand in silence, in a museum, beside a memorial, or by the sea where ships once burned, remember this. The world we live in was built by those who asked for nothing in return. By those whose names faded into the wind, but whose choices changed everything. And if you listen, truly listen, you may still hear her voice among the echoes of history. Hold on a little longer. The light is coming.